There's approximately 7 billion people living on planet Earth today.
So far, 100 billion people have lived a life on this earth.
Are we to assume that all life began through blind chance?
Or could there be another explanation for the beginning of all things?
So, what if it can be shown that all life, the universe and everything in it has been designed with purpose by the Creator God?
Well, welcome everybody. Hopefully you're settled in now, you're in your house groups, you've had a cup of tea or coffee, you're sitting together and eventually, I promise you, you will enjoy one another's company. There's nothing like house groups for getting to know one another in a much deeper and richer way. Anyway, the first 2 weeks, there's Jessie by the way, that's the dog. This is what you call the giant's foot on the cloud here. The first 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at the question as to how the universe, how life, where did it come from? And you've just seen over there that Jodrell Bank is right over there in the distance. And there's a guy from Jodrell Bank that wrote this book here called The Eerie Silence. And he worked there for over 20 years. He was part of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And in the 20 years that he worked there, he never heard so much of a blip from anywhere that there is any kind of life outside of this planet. So he wrote this book, The Eerie Silence. Strangely enough, the guy that built Jodrell Bank, Sir Bernard Lovell, was a committed Christian. In fact, he was a war hero as well. Without his efforts in the war, we probably wouldn't have won the war. He was an amazing man, but after the war, he went and built and designed Jodrell Bank. So yes, he's a committed scientist and also a committed Christian. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at what science says, we're going to be looking at what the Bible says, and hopefully over the next 2 weeks you should be able to see, and I hope you're going to be delighted to see that actually a lot of science today is pointing away from random chance, blind chance, and is pointing towards the absolute necessity for a designer. So, folks, I really hope you enjoy this. I'm excited about it. Sit back, enjoy your cuppa. You're about to watch Lee Strobel and The Case for the Creator.
For as long as humans have been around, they've gazed at the sky and asked the same questions we ask ourselves today. What's out there? Who's out there? Where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? Today, of course, science has sophisticated tools to help us probe the heavens. I'm here in the Quinlan Mountains, some 7,000 feet above the Arizona desert, southwest of Tucson, where the Kitt Peak National Observatory has the largest and the most diverse collection of astronomical instruments in the world. They have over 20 optical and infrared telescopes. They have solar telescopes to explore the sun. And they have 2 radio telescopes like this one, whose job it is to analyze the radio waves that come from celestial objects. The scientists here are trying to answer the riddles that have perplexed humankind from the beginning. Where did the universe come from? How is it that the stars and the galaxies and the planets managed to form? How does the universe function? Why is it able to sustain life? And what's going to happen to it in the end? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of guy who is always full of questions like that. I remember ever since I was a little kid, I was full of curiosity about things. Once my parents gave me a train for Christmas when I was little. And a few hours later, my dad found me in the garage, and I was taking the locomotive and I was throwing it against the cement floor trying to crack it open. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to figure out how it works." I remember after asking so many why questions and so many how questions, my parents went out and they actually bought me an entire set of encyclopedias. And they said, "Look, all of the answers are in there. Go find them yourself." And so I guess it's natural that I would pursue a career as a journalist, because that's what journalists do. They ask the why questions and they ask the how questions. And my guess is this, that you're participating in this curriculum because you'd like some answers too. Maybe you've got questions about what science can and can't tell you about the ultimate issues of life. Well, over these 6 sessions, we're going to go on a journey together. It's a journey that began when I was a teenager, and believed that the evidence of science disproved the existence of God. That's when I first began to consider myself an atheist. I'm going to just lay out the evidence as I uncovered it and discovered it. And I'm going to leave it to you to draw your own conclusions about where you think the evidence most persuasively points. Does it point in the direction of a creator or away from a creator? Are you ready to get started? Well, then let's begin.
Lee Strobel earned a Master of Studies in Law degree from Yale Law School and is the former legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He is the best-selling author of several books that explore the evidence for the Christian faith.
I guess given my curiosity, it's not surprising that when I was in high school, science was my favorite topic, because there the teachers actually encouraged me to cut open frogs and find out how things work, which I thought was great. When I was a teenager, I had this deep trust in science, and I think part of it was prompted by the fact that I grew up in post-Sputnik America, where Eisenhower encouraged all young people to delve into science so we could catch up with the Russians. So to me, science sort of represented the empirical, the hard facts, the things that could be proven experimentally, and that was sort of the way in which I looked at life. I thought people who had faith, people who believed in supernatural things like God, I saw that as a sign of weakness because, do you have any data to back that up?
In the autumn of 1966, Strobel's interest in science led to a life-changing decision.
I can take you back to the exact spot where I was sitting. It was in the third floor, overlooking the asphalt parking lot. I was in the second row, the third chair from the front, when my biology teacher recounted in great detail this experiment that had been conducted in the early 1950s at the University of Chicago.
This experiment that impressed Strobel so deeply was one of the most famous in the history of science. In 1953, Stanley Miller, a graduate chemistry student, tried to demonstrate how life first emerged on Earth. Miller attempted to reproduce the Earth's early atmosphere. He pumped hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and a small amount of water vapor into a maze of glassware. Then sparked the gases with electrical discharges to simulate lightning. After 5 days, he discovered what he had hoped for: a few simple amino acids, the basic building blocks of living organisms, had collected in the dark residue at the bottom of the glass. Many hailed Miller's experiment as proof that essential components of life could have formed in the oceans of the Earth billions of years ago.
The philosophical implications of Miller's experiment were instantly obvious to me. And for me, it was a eureka moment because I heard this and I thought, wait a minute. If you can show scientifically that life can emerge without any outside assistance, if life can emerge just from naturalistic circumstances, then God was out of a job. From there, the acceptance of Darwinian evolution, and full-blown atheism for that matter, was pretty easy. Because if living organisms could emerge by themselves out of this primordial soup without the assistance of any kind of a god or supernatural intervention, then they certainly could develop naturally over the eons into more and more complex creatures, just as Charles Darwin theorized in his book On the Origin of Species.
As Strobel embraced Darwinism and its atheistic implications, he was surprised to discover that many Christians believed their faith was compatible with Darwinian evolution.
There's no way you can harmonize neo-Darwinism with Christianity. I could never understand Christians who would say, well, I believe in God, and yet I believe in evolution as well. You see, Darwin's ideas about the development of life led to his theory that modern science now generally defines as an undirected process, completely devoid of any purpose or plan. Now, how could God direct an undirected process? How could God have purpose and a plan behind a system that has no plan and no purpose? It just does not make sense. Didn't make sense to me in 1966, and it doesn't make sense to me now. In my books, The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith, I talked about the evidence that convinced me of the deity of Jesus and the answers to the tough questions that were stumbling blocks in my spiritual journey. But another critically important aspect of my 2-year investigation of Christianity was the role that science played in propelling me toward atheism. This wasn't just an abstract issue for me. It's a very personal story in which I was pursuing answers to satisfy my heart, my mind, and my soul. Back in the 1960s, in high school classrooms all over America, Miller's experiment was sowing the seeds of atheism into the minds of students like me. It wasn't until the 1980s, when I began to investigate these issues again, that the evidence started to push me toward a far different conclusion. After all, science has come a long way since Miller's experiment way back in 1953. Today we have more discoveries, more data to illuminate these ultimate issues of life. So the question is this: does this deeper and richer pool of contemporary scientific research tend to contradict or confirm the existence of a creator? Or let me put it more personally. Where is the arrow of contemporary science pointing for you, toward or away from God? The view here at the south rim of the Grand Canyon is absolutely spectacular. I can't imagine what it must have been like in 1869 when Major John Wesley Powell made the first recorded journey down the Colorado River. Now, Powell was a colorful character. He lost an arm to a musket shot during the Civil War, but that didn't stop him from becoming a great adventurer who explored a lot of the interior of what is now the United States. Well, when Powell and his team entered the Grand Canyon, which, by the way, is 277 miles long and up to 18 miles wide, he looked at the strata of the sedimentary rocks that form the mile-deep canyon walls. And he said something very interesting. He said, these strata are like leaves in a great storybook. And that is exactly true. Because when you go down into the canyon, you encounter a great story that's told us first by the rocks themselves, which reflect for us the great geological ages of the earth. And then we see it reflected in the fossils that are encountered. Fossils can tell us a lot about creatures that lived in prehistoric times. But can they confirm the grandest claims of neo-Darwinism, which is that all life has a common ancestor, and that the great diversity we see among animal life today is a result of natural selection acting on random mutations over time? Well, some scientists are not so sure. In fact, today we're going to talk about the negative evidence that casts doubt on some of these grandest claims of Darwinism. It's intriguing stuff, but it's challenging as well. So let's get started.
Strobel's search began with an examination of evidence that challenged materialistic theories of life's origin. He discovered that this negative evidence contradicted the textbook explanations that had once convinced him the blind forces of evolution could account for the creation and diversity of life on Earth.
A good example of negative evidence is the 1953 Origin of Life experiment by Stanley Miller, the one that helped lead me into atheism in the first place. As biologist Jonathan Wells explained to me, Miller's experiment has now been thoroughly discredited.
Stanley Miller put together a glass apparatus, and in that apparatus he put a mixture of gases that people at the time thought reflected the atmosphere of the early Earth. And those gases were methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. But then the professional opinion of what was there on the early Earth changed. In the 60s, geochemists revised their hypothesis and decided that the hydrogen, being very light, would have escaped into outer space. The Earth's gravity isn't strong enough to hold it. And probably the early Earth's atmosphere then consisted of what we now see coming out of volcanoes today, namely carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. Well, if the early Earth's atmosphere consisted of those gases, then Stanley Miller's experiment would not work. In fact, he himself tried it with those gases, and he found that he couldn't produce any amino acids at all. So the experiment falls apart once you use a more realistic mixture of gases in the apparatus.
Miller's test has been repeated many times using the correct atmospheric components. The results are always the same. The amino acids that generated so much enthusiasm in 1953 do not appear.
Even if Miller's experiment were valid, you're still light years away from making life. It comes down to this. No matter how many molecules you can produce with early Earth conditions, plausible conditions, you're still nowhere near producing a living cell. And here's how I know. If I take a sterile test tube and I put in it a little bit of fluid with just the right salts, just the right balance of acidity and alkalinity, just the right temperature, the perfect solution for a living cell, and I put in it one living cell, this cell is alive. It has everything it needs for life. Now I take a sterile needle and I poke that cell, and all its stuff leaks out into this test tube. You have in this nice little test tube all the molecules you need for a living cell. Not just the pieces of the molecules, but the molecules themselves. And you cannot make a living cell out of them. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So what makes you think that a few amino acids dissolved in the ocean are going to give you a living cell? It's totally unrealistic.
Well, hi folks, I hope you're enjoying this video so far. You should have just seen a video on an experiment that took place in the 1950s. And I want to read you an excerpt here from a book by a guy called Bill Bryson, who's a committed atheist, absolutely does not believe that there's a creator, but is honest enough to convey in his book the insurmountable task that scientists have of proving that there is no need for a God in the creation of the heavens and the earth. And he picks up on this experiment that Miller and Urey did in the 1950s concerning amino acids. So just to recap, back then in the 50s, they thought that because they'd found amino acids at the bottom of a test tube, then that was it. That was enough to say, hey, there you go, there's no need for God. But 70 years on, we realise now that we are further away than ever of understanding how life could possibly have leapt into existence without the aid of a cause, without the aid of God himself. This is what he says about proteins and the difficulty of amino acids becoming proteins simply by random chance. He says, proteins are what you get when you string together amino acids. And we need a lot of them. No one really knows, but there are as many as 1 million types of protein in the human body. And each one is a little miracle. By all the laws of probability, protein shouldn't exist. To make a protein, you need to assemble amino acids, which I'm obliged by a long tradition to refer to you as the building blocks of life. They are to be arranged in a particular order, in much the same way that you assemble letters in a particular order to spell a word. The problem is that words in the amino acid alphabet are often exceedingly long. To spell collagen, the name of a common type of protein, you need to arrange 8 letters in the right order. To make collagen, that's completely different than spelling it, obviously. To make collagen, you need to arrange 1,055 amino acids in precisely the right sequence. But, and here's an obvious but crucial point, you don't make it, it makes itself spontaneously without direction. This is where the unlikelihoods come in. So I love this guy because he's honest enough to say that simply finding amino acids is light years away from producing even just a single protein, which is also light years away from being anything like a living cell. So he goes on to explain the chances, the probability of amino acids forming into a protein by simply random chance. The chances of a 1,055 sequence molecule like collagen spontaneously self-assembling are frankly nil. It just isn't going to happen. To grasp what a long shot its existence is, visualize a standard Las Vegas slot machine, but broaden greatly to about 27 meters, to be precise, to accommodate 1,055 spinning wheels instead of the usual 3 or 4, and with 20 symbols on each wheel, 1 for each common amino acid. How long would you have to pull the handle on the slot machine? How long would you have to pull the handle before all 1,055 symbols came up in the right order? Effectively forever. Even if you reduce the number of spinning wheels to 200, which is actually more a typical number of amino acids for a protein, the odds against all 200 coming up in a prescribed sequence are 1 in 10 to the 260. That is 1 followed by 260 zeros. That in itself is a larger number than all the atoms in the universe. How honest of this man, Bill Bryson, A Short History of Nearly Everything. How honest of him to say that actually you have more chance of, imagine you could get a Sharpie permanent marker and mark 1 atom out of all the atoms in the universe. I mean, the atoms in my fingernail alone, there are millions and millions of atoms in my fingernail alone. There are literally billions of atoms in this rock behind me. If you look out at this scenery behind me, the amount of atoms in this scenery alone are incomprehensibly so big it would fry anybody's head trying to understand that number. And yet, what this guy says is, imagine you mark out 1 atom out of all the atoms in the universe, and you were blindfolded and you had to find that 1 hidden atom in all the atoms in the universe. He says you have more chance of finding that 1 atom in one go than you have of amino acids, a sequence of amino acids stringing themselves together in exactly the right sequence and folding themselves up in exactly the right way to form a protein. In other words, you ain't got a chance.
When applied to the origin of life and the random formation of large biomolecules, probability theory clarifies the limitations of chance as a creative agent on the primordial Earth. For example, what are the odds a single protein could form exclusively through the blind interactions of chemistry? Our target is one smaller than average molecule made from 150 amino acids, each aligned to ensure a folded chain. Researchers have calculated that on the ancient Earth, the probability of success was 1 chance in 10 to the 164th power. That's 1 correctly sequenced protein chain for every 100 million trillion failed attempts. But despite these enormous odds, some theorists argue that given enough time, anything is possible. Okay, let's test the validity of this opinion. We'll begin by establishing an ideal environment for chemical evolution, an imaginary world that will provide chance with every opportunity to succeed. First, we stock the oceans to capacity with amino acids. That means all the atoms on Earth, including its entire supply of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and sulfur, are available to form 10 to the 41st complete sets of the 20 types of amino acids used to build proteins. Then we'll alter the laws of nature to protect these building blocks from the destructive rays of ultraviolet light and chemical contamination in the primordial soup. Now let's turn the chemistry loose and see what happens. The amino acids start bonding furiously. In our experiment, an entire chain of 150 units self-assembles in only 1 second. Since all 20 types of amino acids are available, at the majority of sites, there is a 5% or 1 in 20 chance the correct molecule will align in the chain. If the sequencing is incorrect, the chain is immediately destroyed and a new assembly begins. Throughout the planet, 6,000 million billion trillion attempts will take place every minute. That means in 4.6 billion years, the oldest estimated age of the Earth, the number of chains that don't fold will exceed 10 to the 58th power. It's a staggering total, but nowhere near 10 to the 164th. The trials necessary, on average, to build a protein of 150 amino acids by chance. So if undirected chemistry can't produce our coveted molecule during the entire history of the Earth, then how much time would have been needed? To find out, let's take a road trip. We'll start by erecting a bridge that spans the diameter of the observable universe, a distance of more than 90 billion light years. Then we'll place an amoeba on one end of the bridge. This single-celled organism will travel at the breakneck speed of 1 foot per year. It's off. While we wait for one protein to form, by chance, the amoeba slides along for more than 5 billion years to cross the entire universe and then return. But this race is just getting started. The amoeba takes off again, successfully reaches the far side of the cosmos, then heads back home. Yet not even one functional protein is anywhere in sight. For the next trip, we'll add a payload, a single atom. After inching its way another 500 billion trillion miles, the amoeba drops off its cargo and returns for more. Will it get back before our lucky protein forms? Absolutely. In fact, it will complete another 10 round trips, then 20, 100, 1,000. and there's still no sign of a usable molecule. The amoeba continues making round trips until it has hauled off every atom on Earth. Then, all of the atoms in our solar system. Then, every planet and star in the Milky Way galaxy, one atom at a time. In fact, as we wait for one protein to self-assemble, the amoeba has so much time that moving at just 1 foot a year and carrying 1 atom per round trip, it will transport the entire universe more than 56 million times. That's how long it would take for Chance to build one functional protein.
Now, suppose against all odds, chemical evolution produced our single functional protein. Would we have life? No. We'd have one protein, just a lifeless arrangement of amino acids. The simplest living cell we know has more than 300 different proteins. But proteins are only part of the story when you consider any actual cell. Remember, you're going to have carbohydrates, complex sugars, nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, lipids, a whole variety of different chemicals which jointly constitute the living state. Those bits and pieces all have to be brought into the same microenvironment at the same moment in time.
Each chemical building block must then be assembled and organized into the network of molecular machines that will control every facet of life.
If we can appreciate exactly how hard it is to produce one molecular machine using nothing except atoms and energy, we can see that there's a profound problem, because once you have one molecular machine, you don't have a living thing. These molecular machines need other molecular machines. And even if nature was capable of producing all the molecular machines necessary, that still wouldn't be enough. They have to all be together, all in this tiny little membrane-bound space that we call a cell.
From my understanding of what it takes to make a cell, it has to happen all at once. You can't do it one bit at a time, because everything works together in a causal loop. The higher level of organization transcends the pieces. The spatial organization in the cell requires that molecules end up in the right place at the right time. The DNA is copied into RNA. The polymerase that does the copying has to find the right spot in the DNA to start copying. The RNA has to somehow hook up with ribosomes, which have to be in a particular place. And the proteins then that are made have to be going to a particular place. That's an awful lot to account for by random chance.
The probability that you would get them in the same space at the same time becomes beyond unimaginable. And the probability that you would get them within a membrane enclosure, like a cell, is the next best thing to impossible.
Stanley Miller's experiment was not the only unsuccessful attempt to explain how life originated. Beginning with Russian chemist Alexander Oparin's work in the 1920s, theorists have also proposed chance, chemical attraction, and biological seeding from outer space as possible answers.
Who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
Strobel's examination of negative evidence did not end with the question of first life. He also learned of weaknesses in the most celebrated icon of Darwinian evolution.
In Darwin's book on the origin of species, there's only one illustration. It's called the Tree of Life. Darwin used it to explain how every species of animal and plant that ever existed on Earth had evolved from the same common ancestor through small, gradual steps over enormous periods of time. Even though Darwin's Tree of Life is included in virtually every biology textbook published over the last half-century, contrary to what we've been told, there is no conclusive evidence of the common origin of all life.
Perhaps the most damaging blow to Darwin's theory is the fossil record. If all living organisms have descended from the same primitive life form, then the rock strata of the Earth should be filled with the fossilized remains of animals that were once part of a great evolutionary chain. A chain of small biological modifications, ultimately leading to a spectacular diversity of life. Yet, after 2 centuries of research, highlighted by excavations in southern China, the multitude of transitional experiments, or missing links, that should exist are conspicuous only by their absence. The most graphic example of this void in the fossil record is a geological era known as the Cambrian explosion.
The branching tree pattern of Darwin's theory is actually not seen anywhere in the fossil record unless we impose it with our own minds. So the Cambrian explosion is the most dramatic refutation of the Tree of Life.
The Cambrian explosion of life was a dramatic episode in geological history. Usually dated at about 530 million years ago, the exquisitely preserved Cambrian fossils reveal that the body plans for virtually every major animal phyla appeared, not gradually and slowly as Darwin had speculated, but instead with astonishing suddenness.
If we imagine the whole history of life on Earth taking place in one 24-hour period, the current standard estimates for the origin of life put it at about 3.8 billion years ago, let's say 4 billion. So if we start the clock then, our 24-hour clock, 6 hours, nothing but these simple single-celled organisms appear, the same sort that we saw in the beginning. 12 hours, same thing. 18 hours, same thing. 3/4 of the day has passed, and all we have are these simple single-celled organisms. Then at about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, boom, most of the major animal forms appear in the form that they currently have in the present. And many of them persist to the present, and we have them with us today. Less than 2 minutes out of a 24-hour period. That's how sudden the Cambrian explosion was.
In a geological instant, the animal kingdom leaped from small, relatively simple organisms to extraordinary creatures with spinal cords, compound eyes, and articulated limbs. The record of this explosion of life looks nothing like Darwin's slowly branching tree.
Darwin's theory is that there's a tree of life, where you have one organism diverging into many other organisms and big differences appearing at the top. What we really see is from here up. This does not exist in the fossil record. If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn with separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other. And those would be the phyla. Now, within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification, but even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life. That would make them a tree of life. As scientists, it's not our job to force the evidence into a theory that just doesn't fit it. And so I have absolutely no desire or reason to uphold Darwin's theory at this point.
I think what we're seeing today is a series of scientific discoveries that are opening the eyes of more and more scientists to say, wait a minute, I can no longer believe that pure naturalistic processes can account for the origin and diversity of life. There must be something else here.
The challenges to Darwinian theory have led more than 600 scientists with PhDs from major universities throughout the world to sign a document titled A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism. It reads in part, "We are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life."
These are scientists with PhDs from Stanford and Berkeley and University of Chicago and Cambridge, major universities, who've looked hard and fast at the evidence and have walked away saying, I am not convinced. Maybe there's another explanation. Personally, the negative evidence forced me to conclude that Darwinism would require a blind leap of faith that I just had no good reason to make.
We are here to talk about big questions. Maybe the biggest question of all, does God exist? I won't give you a proof tonight, but I hope I will give you some things to think about. Things that have led me from being an atheist to becoming a believer and a follower of Jesus.
Perhaps the most widespread fundamental assumption in the intellectual West today is that there is no reality beyond what natural science discovers, and that there is no authority or good higher than the freedom of the individual. Now, both science and individual freedom are good, but followers of Jesus, like me, have a different view. We believe that both the deepest reality and the highest moral meaning, or good, or authority, are to be found in loving relationship.
Why is nature regular? Why does it follow regular laws? Why can we understand them? And we're so used to these ideas today that we don't realize that they weren't actually that obvious to most people through most time. And the reason for that is that if you just live in the natural world, it doesn't seem to be always that regular. It seems to be capricious. It changes itself all the time. And so what you can show, I think quite decisively historically, is that these ideas, these metaphysical underpinnings of science, uniformity, regularity, intelligibility, have deep theological roots. Their roots go back to a long history of theological reflection on a God who is faithful and sustains the world, therefore, in a regular way.
But just simply the idea that the universe could be expanding, not sort of expanding into something, but just that the space-time metric changes and that there could be a beginning of time is just incredible. I mean, if you go back to before Einstein's work, and you go to Newtonian world, there's basically a coordinate system. There's X, Y, and Z, and T, right? And these are just fixed, and things happen in this grid, and you describe physical processes and events by putting them in this grid. And the idea that the universe was changing is just completely ludicrous to many people. And then along comes Einstein, and now we realize that space-time not only can expand and contract, but through the work of Hubble, it actually is. The universe is expanding, and so if you play it back, there was a time when the universe was incredibly small and tiny. That to me is just mind-boggling, and it actually adds to my sort of confidence that the creation story has some merit.
I certainly have colleagues who speak very much the way I used to speak. You know, like, how can you believe in something that you can't, prove mathematically or show in this way? And in fact, a friend of mine who's a mathematician used to say that to me. How can you believe in something that you can't prove? I only believe in things I can prove. And then one day he was reading a history book, and his friend, who happened to be a Christian, said, why are you reading that history book? You can't prove any of that. And he realized there's a lot of truth that has happened in the past that we can't prove today like you can a mathematical thing. And furthermore, of course, all of our science and our math rest upon axioms and things that we take at faith. So people who think that they can't deal with faith are really just deceiving themselves.
So what I'm fond of saying, and I'll say it again tonight, is I don't have the faith to be an atheist. To me, the universe does require an explanation. The philosopher's very ancient question of why is there something rather than nothing is still a valid question. And as many people, including physicist Paul Davies, have pointed out, the laws of physics themselves demand an explanation that stands somehow out of science. Whether that is a physical explanation or a spiritual explanation, nature is not self-explanatory. And ultimately, if I had to tell someone why I am a theist, it is because precisely I think that nature, as we see it, requires an explanation. And the more we know of the world from science, the more it begs that explanation.
I start by saying there is a God who created the universe, and he's not an impersonal God. He has declared himself as a loving God who seeks a relationship with us and also gives us free will to choose him or not. And our purpose then is found in being in relationship with him.
The order and structure of the natural laws, to me, suggests a God who ordained and conceived those laws. The astonishing complexity of living things, to me, suggests an architect who cares about those things. The fact that there is something rather than nothing suggests the existence of a creator of that something. And indeed, one of the joys I have in studying the natural sciences is that I learn a little bit about what God has done. And in the process, I think I come to understand a little bit of what he is like. He is much bigger, much grander, much more awesome, much more majestic than I would have previously imagined.
See, science, it provides a set of tools that are useful for investigating phenomena in the natural world. But as powerful as it may be for dissecting planetary motion and battling cancer, it's not really intended for questions like, why did life forms originate in the first place? And we're free to speculate, opine, and have our beliefs, but science is not equipped to answer questions like this. This doesn't itself mean, let me be clear here, that there is an answer somewhere else. It just means that we have to be faithful to what science is, and that we can't extend the purview of science beyond what it is capable of addressing.
The Lord led me to genetics, and I don't have time to get into that story, but it's a fascinating story. How he led me to genetics. It was not what I had planned to do, but my goodness, I'm so happy I did. I can't imagine myself doing anything else, but I see it all as part of his plan to lead me to that and to help me to see identity in a whole different way. And when I think about my own identity, I think of Christ and how he created us. He created us in his image, so we had identity with him. And then we sinned, and his grace, we talk about grace, his grace, through his grace, he wanted to bring us back in relationship with him and to bring us back in identity with him.